After the absolute emotional train wreck I was in after experiencing Water 7 and Enies Lobby back to back, I was really curious where the story of One Piece was going to take us next. In a saga that felt so huge, so emotional, and truly so important to the story, I assumed Thriller Bark had to be somewhat of a cooldown from the chaos. It's too bad that nothing happened, so thanks for tuning in and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Okay, but for real, in some ways, Thriller Bark really is a cooldown from the earlier chaos. But in certain moments of the arc, it once again finds more ways to just rip your heart out of your chest. In an arc that's able to capture so many of the things that I love about One Piece, like the crew's humor and teamwork, it also packs in a few of my favorite moments in the entire show so far. So let's get into a review of the silliest and spookiest arc yet, Thriller Bark. Thriller Bark to me is an arc filled with many pros, but it's not exempt from a few significant cons as well, which is why it becomes the hardest arc for me to rate yet. I'm gonna give a brief pros and cons list overview of the arc before diving into the specifics. So let's start with the first pro and what I thought was the arc's biggest strength, the theme. I think Thriller Bark might have the most immersive themed location of the show so far. There have been other places with really strong identities like Drum Island with the snowy village theme, Alabasta and a desert kingdom, or Skypiea even feels like a giant fantasy fairy tale adventure in the clouds. But I really feel like Thriller Bark had such a unique and fleshed out feel from start to finish. It has this Halloween, Nightmare Before Christmas, Scooby-Doo kind of vibe in its settings, characters, and storylines. And since I'm already a huge sucker for Halloween and Tim Burton styled media in general, I was really suckered into enjoying this arc from the get-go. And maybe even more than the setting itself, the next pro on my list, the comedy. The comedy in this arc was absolute gold. The show already has great comedic timing and is one of my favorite things about it, but Thriller Bark felt like one of the funniest arcs in the entire series so far. It was just consistently throwing hilarious moments at you. And after how heavy Enies Lobby was, I really did appreciate that a lot. The last major positive on my list is that the arc has some really memorable moments, both in fights and story. Now, not every fight in the arc was amazing to me, but the ones that hit were really great. And then on top of the fights, this arc has two specific moments near the end that immediately elevated the entire thing. And I'm sure you can probably guess exactly what two moments I'm referring to. These two moments were not just good moments to me, they were even arc-defining moments. But like I said, all of this will be explored in more detail as we go through the video. Now, as many great moments and bits as this arc had, it definitely had some weaknesses too. The first being that the pacing was not the best. And I know people are gonna say it's just something that you have to expect with One Piece at this point, which I somewhat agree with, but I do think it's still worth mentioning in a first-time watcher review of the media. Now, I don't think the pacing of this arc was as bad as some of the universally accepted bad pacing arcs, such as Skypiea or Syrup Village, but it was definitely noticeable at times. Another con is I really didn't care too much for the side characters of this arc, the main culprit being Absalom, but also some other characters like Dr. Hogback or Hedon. I just never felt too strongly about them throughout my watch. The characters and their storylines in this arc fit the theme pretty well, but I just don't think its supporting cast was nearly as strong as arcs like Water 7 or Alabasta. Also, this does not apply for my queen Perona. She rocked. I'm just throwing that out early. And the final con, something I just had to mention in my review here, the perversion bit. I've noticed it happen occasionally before, but the moments it happened in this arc felt extremely apparent. Now, it's not something that ruins the show for me or anything like that, but it's becoming one of those reoccurring bits where I'm rolling my eyes every time it happens. But we'll get into the specifics later. Now, with our pros and cons list in mind, we can begin our review of Thriller Bark. I'm gonna split this review into 4 main parts as we move through the arc's storyline, which are the arrival and setup, the fight scenes, Kuma's arrival, and Brook's outro. So let's get into it, and if at any point you're enjoying the video, feel free to drop a like and subscribe as it helps the video out a lot and I would really appreciate it. Point number 1, the arrival and setup. With the crew all back together, they set off on their new ship for Fishman Island. But first, they must travel through Oda's version of the Bermuda Triangle, the Florian Triangle, a part of the sea filled with disappearing ships, fog, and a bony fellow with an amazing laugh, which is where we meet our first character, Brook. Brook has easily become one of my favorite characters, and his entrance definitely played a part in that. When we first see Brook, he's purposely written to look scary by humming a mysterious song on a ghost ship in the fog as it passes by. But once the crew's on board, it immediately cuts to his real goofy self, laughing, sipping tea, and making dad jokes. Brook's overall attitude and humor throughout this arc made me really start to like him so much, and he was one of the first Straw Hats to join since Drum Island that didn't start out as a villain, which was kind of refreshing. His character design is extremely One Piece coded, a tall skeleton man with a big afro and a fancy Victorian style outfit, which I liked. And of course, as we get to the end of the arc, his development as a character with the crew and learning his lore brought me to tears. Knowing all the pain and suffering Brook has been living with for the past 50 years, and still to be this fun and silly guy made him such an amazing character overall. My only complaint with him was the perversion bit, like when he first met Nami asking about her underwear, but like I said, I'll dive into this issue more later. When the crew first meets Brook, Luffy basically speedruns him joining the crew. But later on, he begins to explain his situation about his shadow being stolen as one of the arc's main plot points starts getting set up. After their conversation at dinner and Luffy explaining how they'll get his shadow back for him, Brook decides to decline Luffy's offer and skedaddles off as the crew gets sucked into the gates of Thriller Bark. Once the crew arrives at Thriller Bark, we really start to see the theme of the arc shine. A giant haunted ship island full of gothic architecture, graveyards, weird stitched together creatures and zombies wandering around. It's just such a fun setting. And again, I think this is the most fleshed out theme the show has done so far. I love Halloween, and Nightmare Before Christmas is a top 3 Disney movie for me. I felt like this arc had a lot of similarities to it, such as the main villain being a big rotund man like Boogeyman, his 3 henchmen doing tasks for him, all the stitched up characters around. Honestly, the theme alone kind of carried this arc for me a bit, since no matter how good, bad, or slow the story was moving along, I was just kind of enjoying the atmosphere. And I'm curious if anyone else connects with this point, because theme isn't really the same kind of substance to comment on like story or character development. It's just something I personally tend to value a lot, and it made this arc feel a little more special to me. Going forward, the crew gets split up as Usopp, Chopper, and Nami get swept away when testing out the Mini Mary, a mini tribute ship that Frankie built for them after losing the Mary, which I thought was a really wholesome scene. It really made me like Frankie even more than I already had. We know he's a thoughtful and emotional guy when it comes to loyal friendship, but knowing he'll take action on those emotions and build something like the Mini Mary is both really sweet and also makes me excited to see if he cooks up any more ideas like that on the Sunny. Usopp, Chopper, and Nami's trio adventure through the haunted house of Thriller Bark was one of my favorite parts of the entire arc. The 3 of them being the most terrified to go into this place, being the ones stranded on it, made it such a hilarious gag, and again, felt very Scooby-Doo-esque. During their mental torture of surviving this scary adventure, we meet some of the main side characters of the arc. The first being Hedon, who was not all that interesting to be honest and played mostly like the messenger role of the arc, but we were also introduced to a character with a much more prominent role, Dr. Hogback. Dr. Hogback was a relatively interesting character, more so for the actions he was doing versus his actual personality. As we discover, he's the man helping bring zombies to life on this ship. He also has a crazy laugh. However, the way in which Dr. Hogback was introduced made him much more of an interesting character to begin with, mainly due to Chopper's reaction. Chopper immediately recognizes his name as essentially the most famous doctor in the Doctors Only subreddit, so just upon hearing his name he lights up. Look how excited he was. Seeing Chopper so excited to meet this famous doctor made for a really good setup. It gives the encounter an emotional angle because Chopper really wants to admire him, and Chopper being such a determined doctor to help people, you're given the assumption that this Dr. Hogback guy has to be a great dude. This is why the later reveal of what's really going on with Hogback and his operations became much more impactful, as it shattered both the viewers and Chopper's illusions of him. And then, the final character we meet here early on is Sindri, Dr. Hogback's zombie sidekick who hates plates. As the trio runs around the house and stuff starts unfolding about Sindri and the zombies, the whole mansion section becomes much more unsettling. They come across a room full of pictures of Sindri when she was alive and start to piece together a loose story of her situation. And while we aren't given a full explanation just yet, this whole setup did a good job making the place feel off-putting in a way that was much more interesting than just simple Halloween gags. It starts introducing the idea that something more twisted could be going on underneath this goofy horror show. As Chopper, Usopp, and Nami fight for their life inside the freak show house, the rest of the crew set off to go find them, and we get some of the funniest scenes in all of One Piece so far. Luffy barks at a Cerberus. The crew gets depressed after being ghosted. And Luffy shoves a zombie back into the ground. This moment might be the funniest thing I've seen in a long time. There is something wrong with him. But moments like this are a huge part of why I love Luffy so much as a main character. He can feel so inspiring, determined, and larger than life at times that moments like this snap you right back into the fact that he's also just a dumb, lovable idiot, and that only makes me like him even more. When the crew got ghost depression, we met one of my favorite characters of this entire arc, and honestly one of my favorite characters in the entire show now, Perona. Perona was one of those characters that whenever she was on the screen, I was just loving watching her. She was goofy, her character design was amazing, and I liked her devil fruit ability and the comedy that it came with. Her laugh is also one of the most absurd laughs in One Piece. Her ghosts fly around and make people depressed, like Moria could have just opened an SSRI business and became a billionaire using Perona. She adds so much charm to this arc just by existing. Every time she showed up, she made Thriller Bark feel even more silly, weird, and just overall more memorable. Before making it into the mansion, the crew runs into this old man on the road, and this is where the arc really starts shifting from a funny Halloween adventure into its actual central conflict. We find out this ship has a warlord of the sea on it by the name of Gecko Moria. Moria is the one taking people's shadows and dooming their bodies to a life away from the sun, just like Brook said happened to him earlier. If your shadow's taken, you can no longer live a normal life. Going into the sunlight instantly kills you, which means the victims of Thriller Bark are stuck in this horrible state where they're still alive, but can never really return to the world that they came from. That concept made me realize Moria is genuinely one of the most evil villains of the show so far, because now he isn't just a strong opponent that the crew has to defeat, but the reason for an entire group of people that are trapped on the ship depending on someone to save them. What started off as a fun, spooky island suddenly becomes something way darker, and that becomes even more apparent once we finally meet Moria, the man at the helm of this ghost ship and the captain of the Thriller Bark pirates. I liked the way Moria was introduced with the creepy shots of his face in the dark, the glowing red eyes and everything. He did lose a bit of aura once the lights came on, and he turned out to be this big, rotund clown monster, but I did appreciate how unique his look was. My favorite thing about him though was his ability and how versatile it was, with so many different ways it could be used, whether to create shadow zombies, fight in combat, or even power himself up as we find out later. Similar to Enel, it felt like we didn't see the full potential of Moria's powers until the very end of the arc, which I find really interesting. And on top of that, his whole commitment to being the laziest yet strongest pirate possible was honestly a kind of hilarious villain trait. I low-key kind of respected it. As the story progresses, Zoro, Sanji, and Luffy's shadows are all taken by Moria in a scene that I thought looked really cool. Like, this shot was so awesome and nailed the whole horror villain vibe really well. Sanji's shadow is stuffed into a penguin and Zoro's into a zombie who had one of the funniest moments where he just randomly says a Zoro line to confuse Luffy. Zoro! And Luffy's shadow is stuffed into who will become the main problem to deal with for this arc, a massive zombie giant by the name of Oars. And if Moria himself wasn't a problem enough, the setup to Oars made it clear that Thriller Bark is now going to have one massive physical threat looming over everything, giving the arc a massively secondary obstacle to overcome. To me, this introduction to Oars made the arc feel so much larger in scale. Oars also felt like a character with a lot of lore behind him, and I feel like we're definitely going to be hearing about him more later on at some point. It was said he's from the Ice Country and used to roam the seas 500 years ago, and also that he built something called the Evil Country and is called the Devil. I'm not sure how those are going to play out in the future, if at all, but it definitely felt like something to note down during my watch. When your shadow is taken by Moria, your body must remain alive for the shadow to work inside its new host. So Moria sends Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji's unconscious bodies back to the Sunny. Before the rest of the crew arrive back at the ship, Frankie and Robin encounter a massive spider monkey who just repeats the phrase monkey, monkey, monkey over and over. Frankie whips out these massive pillar nunchucks, which were sick, and Robin just decides to show us that she can fly. This reveal was so crazy. Like, what? I already knew Robin was an angel, but now she was actually one physically and spiritually. You go, queen. As the two are struggling to defeat the big spider monkey, we hear some humming in the distance when all of a sudden, Brook comes out of nowhere and performs his signature move, the 3-pace hum, which is badass. After he helps Robin and Frankie out, he explains that he returned to finally beat the man who has his shadow, and also gives us more explanation on how Moria's shadow tech works by stating when a host gains someone's shadow, they ultimately gain their traits and capabilities too, leveling them up as a warrior for his army. This immediately made the problem way scarier, because now this giant 500-year-old monster zombie was about to get Luffy's personality. The main threat of this arc is literally carrying the most chaotic person in this whole story inside of it. I was nervous, but also excited to see how this was going to play out by this point in the arc. And the other thing Brook mentions here, and was the craziest part of the arc to me so far, is that he was part of the crew who traveled with my boy Laboon. Man, this reveal was so crazy and came out of nowhere. So much had happened since we last heard of Laboon, and hearing his name already brought back so many great memories. I could only imagine what this was like for people who were watching the series every week as it aired. Learning that Brook's determination to live came from needing to one day reunite with his friend who's been waiting for him all this time was so heartbreaking. And this is one of my favorite things that One Piece does. It'll take something from way earlier in the story that already meant a lot and suddenly gives it a whole new emotional weight again. Moments like this make the world feel so much more connected and alive, and is why I appreciate Oda's writing so much. I will say here though, the pacing of the flashbacks with Laboon were a bit long, like almost an entire episode was just flashbacks to Reverse Mountain, which I assume was the anime filling time, but regardless, a very emotional moment still for me. Most of the crew reunite on the Sunny. Usopp performs a great trick to wake up the knocked out trio. 美女の剣豪が肉ぶってやってきたぞ！美女？肉？剣豪？ and Sanji learns that Nami has been abducted, to which he quite literally blows up at. Up until this point, the arc was still mostly building its world, explaining Moria's power, and setting up the danger attached to the Thriller Bark pirates. But now, 3 of the members' shadows were taken and Nami was abducted, which meant the conflict became much more personal for the crew, especially Sanji, and the race against time starts to feel much more urgent. There's a warlord of the sea on this island who's taking people's shadows and trapped them onto the ship. There's a giant monster who has Luffy's shadow and 2 smaller monsters who have Sanji and Zoro's. Brook is on a mission to get his own shadow back from a samurai warrior, and Nami has been taken. With all of these plot points set up and the tension fully built, the crew heads for the castle as we begin the multitude of fights scattered throughout this arc, which leads us to section 2, the fight scenes. The first one we'll start with is Luffy and Moria's first encounter. Luffy runs into Ora's storage room to find Moria, and in true Luffy fashion, starts throwing hands with a warlord of the sea without a second thought. Moria began to surprise me with all the different techniques he was able to use with his devil fruit powers, and started to give us hints that even though he's not the most physically active villain we've ever seen, we should not underestimate his combat abilities. Then we had Zoro vs Ryuma, which was probably the coolest fight visually in the arc. Ryuma is introduced as a legendary dragon-slaying samurai from a place called Wano, which I am aware is a future arc name, so I'm curious if that's going to come into play at all, but also, he's the man who currently has Brooks' shadow. This was explained earlier in the arc when Brook has a flashback about attempting to defeat Ryuma once before but not being able to, which made this fight have a lot more weight to it than just defeating an enemy to move forward. He uses a special sword called Shusui, I hope I pronounced that right, which is referred to as one of the 21 Owazamono swords, which Zoro clearly has his eye on taking, especially since one of his 3 swords at the moment was rusted up by a guy during Annie's lobby. So even with Zoro nerfed at 2 sword style, the fight itself was sick. It was 2 sword style characters fighting on a rooftop, it had lots of really cool visuals, and ended in a satisfying Zoro dub, which meant Brook got his shadow back, which was awesome. Zoro also claimed the new sword out of it too, which made the whole thing a lot more memorable. Overall, it was a very solid fight. Then we had Chopper and Robin versus Dr. Hogback and Sindri. This was a much simpler fight, but there was something during this fight that really caught my attention. And no, it wasn't Robin tricking Hogback into making the Zoro and Sanji zombies jump out the window to the Ode of Joy song, which was just the most absurdly amazing thing ever. It was the moment in this fight that Chopper's strong moral compass comes into play as him and the other doctors' ideologies clash. Because for Chopper, this was not just another fight. This became about what it really means to be a doctor. After learning about Sindri's heartbreaking backstory and how she was forced to become a zombie to appease this creep Dr. Hogback's fantasies of being with her, Chopper and Hogback get into an argument of what makes a good doctor. Dr. Hogback is fueled by greed and thinks him resurrecting zombies that are forced to operate under his control is considered bringing a person back to life, to which Chopper does not take lightly. He knows the morality behind this is wrong and that Sindri, for example, does not have free will in this moment and is essentially being held captive in this body. Watching him deal with Hogback's complete lack of respect for life hit way harder because Chopper cares so genuinely about medicine and helping people. And seeing Sindri struggle in this moment and thinking back to how excited Chopper was to meet Hogback at the beginning is really what made this whole moment special to me. So even if this was not the most complex fight in the arc, the emotional and thematic side to it worked so well, and it also made me proud to be a Chopper stan. That's my freaking boy. Then we get to my favorite fight in the entire arc, Usopp vs Perona. This fight begins when Zoro, Frankie, and Usopp encounter her in her room filled with her cute stuffed animal army, which is also kind of creepy considering they're all just shadows of actual dudes inside these stuffed animals. She uses her negative ghost attack, which takes out Frankie and Zoro, but Usopp is completely unaffected. And then we get the iconic what the hell face from Perona, just like what happened to Eneru. I believe I read somewhere that Oda uses this face when someone has met their perfect counter, like the most shocked expression you could fathom. And that's when we discover that Usopp cannot be affected by negative thoughts, as he already thinks of every negative outcome that could ever happen in any situation ever, which I thought was just hilarious. What made this even funnier is when Perona and her ghosts see this, and they themselves get emotional too, telling Usopp that there's so much to live for and that he shouldn't be sad. She's just so funny, bro. I love her character. The two fight more as Perona turns big and Usopp lights Kumashi on fire. Poor Kumashi, man. But then, real cinema occurs on screen when out of nowhere, a goat returns. Yes, Soga King has somehow made his way onto the island and saved Usopp. I don't know how he got here so fast, but that is the goat. Soga King and Perona continue to fight, and we discover Perona is not actually Perona, but actually an out-of-body experience version of herself, as her real body is revealed inside a room. Soga King's mask falls falls to the ground and somehow Usopp is back to finish the job. I don't know where Sogeking went, but I hope he's alright. One of my favorite parts of this whole fight is when Usopp fakes missing a shot here on Perona, only to later be revealed that he stuck her hand to the wall so she couldn't escape again. And then, in another goofy but really well done way to end the fight, Usopp tricks Perona into experiencing so much fear that she literally passes out. He covered her in her biggest fear, yucky bugs, which were actually fake, and almost hits her with a 10-ton hammer, which is a balloon. It was such a well-executed moment for Usopp, and it really bumped Usopp a lot on my ranking of him. He executed this fight so well, and even after the gimmick of him being immune to Perona's ability, he still overcame a tough obstacle using his brains. So shout out to Usopp for real on this one, that was a great fight. Next, we get to what is inarguably the worst part of the arc for me, which is the Sanji and Absalom encounter. Which sucks because I was actually excited going into it. Now, Absalom I did not like in almost every regard. When we first meet him, I thought it was pretty cool that he's like the leader of the zombie army, which that army had a lot of cool looking designs and members, but then you find out he's the invisible thing that licked Robin on the ship or straight up violated Nami in the shower room earlier. Yeah, nah, I'm out. This guy sucks. Which is why I was so excited to see Sanji get fired up about that, because I was ready for him to kick his ass. Sanji's always the guy who protects the ladies of the Straw Hat crew, is courteous and chivalrous, and yes, he can be a bit simpy at times, but it never crossed any lines in my opinion, and more so always feels like a running gag of his character trait that you kind of just roll your eyes at occasionally. So when he heard all of the things that Absalom did and that he was gonna try and marry Nami, I was like, oh yeah, he's about to beat the brakes off this freak. Only for the entire buildup to be ruined when Sanji reveals part of the anger leading up to this is because Absalom stole his previous dream of being the invisible man, an ability Sanji wanted growing up so that he could also be a pervert to women. Like, bruh, I love Sanji, I really do, and at moments he's even my favorite in the crew, but come on man, what was this? This is for real the first time I was watching the show and kinda got completely taken out. The thought of a Straw Hat wanting to be that way, even to this day, just kinda rubbed me the wrong way. Now, I think in this moment there are factors that can kind of ease this disappointment a tad. The first being that the episodes of the show I'm on are like 20 years old. So a time gap of what was socially acceptable back then to now, even in American culture, has dramatically changed. Now, I don't know how relevant that is to Japanese culture, but I feel like that perhaps maybe played a small role. The other factor I considered is that this is my first anime pretty much ever, and I'm not really sure if this is just a common thing that happens in other animes, as just a disconnect of what is seen as weird in some cultures and laughed at casually by others, but I still don't know. Regardless, I still love Sanji, and I'm praying that this is sort of just a one-off situation that isn't brought up much again. As for the actual fight between these two, there were a few cool moments like Sanji kicking off the invisible blasters, but ultimately Sanji loses and Nami is taken away again. Then we get a little redemption from what happened earlier when Nami wakes up and is able to fight back against Absalom. Something I really liked about this encounter was when Lola showed up and decided to help her new friend Nami escape, but Nami decides to not abandon Lola and turns back to help. It was a very wholesome moment between two girls of the show, and it felt like a great bonding moment that becomes important at the end of the arc. Nami is really such an awesome and important character to me. She's a very strong-headed and independent member of the crew, so to see her in situations like what just happened with Absalom just kind of feels like a cheap way to heighten a villain's evilness at times, which I don't love. But hey, Oda has done almost nothing wrong in the story so far to me, so we'll see how it all plays out. And finally, we get to the main centerpiece battle of the arc, the fight against Oars. This fight had lots of different sections, and to be honest, is where I think the pacing of the arc hit its all-time low. Many times while watching this fight unfold, it felt like it dragged on and wasn't really going anywhere, but there were definitely parts that I enjoyed and are worth highlighting. As a concept, I was really excited for this fight. We have a 500-year-old zombie giant with the personality and traits of Luffy stuffed inside of it about to fight the crew. Like, that's sick and is also hilarious. I love how they made Oars feel threatening and goofy at the same time. It felt very on brand for this arc. My favorite part of the fight with Oars was getting to see the entire crew work together against one enemy, almost like a raid team fighting a boss. It wasn't just a bunch of isolated one-on-one or duo fights. It was the crew trying combo moves, coordinated attacks, and just doing whatever they could to survive this giant monster, which was a lot of fun at first. It also had some great moments, like Oars recognizing Sanji from his picture-perfect bounty poster, Frankie discovering Fortnite strats 15 years too early, and when the team all of a sudden pulled out an Exodia move called Big Emperor. This caught me so off guard, first of all, and the animation looked so sick. And then Robin's reaction to it was so funny.
人として恥ずかしいわ。
This arc constantly kept a good balance of weird, intense, and funny moments sprinkled into some of the fights, which I really appreciated. Like I said though, a lot of this fight felt really slow. Then, we arrive at the final section of the Oars battle when Moria and Luffy join in. One thing I actually did like about Moria during the later parts of the fight is how he just kept escalating in power, just like Eneru did in Skypiea. Every time it felt like the crew was finally gaining some ground, he pulled out another twist. In this scenario, his ability to swap places with the shadows he summons, his ability to manipulate shadows' forms, and being able to absorb all the shadows in his vicinity to power up, I thought it was really cool. I could see some people not actually liking this trait though when shows or movies have villains that constantly pull out hidden moves during their fights, but for me, as long as those moves make sense and aren't some sort of completely new concept that couldn't be theorized beforehand, I'm all for it. And in addition, a move like him absorbing all the shadows of Thriller Bark to level up came at a cost, as his movement was much more restrictive, so there was even a trade-off. Overall, I thought him constantly leveling up his moves in the fight kept it interesting and was probably where I enjoyed seeing Moria's involvement of the arc the most. When Moria enters Oars to control him in the fight, we cut to Luffy and see all the people stuck in the forest of Thriller Bark work together to help Luffy become stronger, in hopes he can be their ticket back to a normal life. And this is done by stuffing Luffy with the shadow of 100 people, turning him into Nightmare Luffy, which is one of those concepts that's so ridiculous it kinda circles back into being awesome and fits the arc. We get to see Luffy use a sword with ease, which was sick. And as the crew is down to their last leg, Nightmare Luffy swoops in, aura farms, and stops Oars after giving him a good beating. This moment was great because earlier, we learned that Oars had moved Thriller Bark out of the Florian Triangle fog, meaning sunrise was coming soon, which meant in turn, impeding doom for not only the people in the forest, but half of the Straw Hat crew now too. So Luffy beating Oars felt like a huge relief as everyone began to cheer. But then, when some kind of hope felt restored, like I mentioned earlier, Moria pulls out a new trick and powers up using all the shadows on Thriller Bark, making their chances to survive before the sun feel hopeless. The tension here was really well executed, and seeing all the happiness everyone felt slowly fade when Moria rose again was a great villain moment in my opinion. The sun is rising, time is running out, and the final fight against Moria and Luffy began, which also had some cool moments. Luffy goes second and third gear at the same time, which is a crazy concept that we now know can happen, and he uses every last bit of his body to finish the fight as the sun begins to come out. And he did it. Everyone's shadow returns as we not only see the joy of people on Thriller Bark getting their lives back, but also all of the people who weren't even on Thriller Bark anymore feeling this sense of joy after so many years of being locked inside. Seeing everyone recover their shadows was a really satisfying scene. It almost felt like a physical representation of the positive effect Luffy spreads across the sea and how it can affect even the people they aren't aware of, and that made it memorable. So while I do think this large-scale fight had a good amount of pacing issues and certain moments that weren't all that interesting, it did have a lot of things to admire. However, just when you think the fighting of this arc is over, we arrive at Section 4, Kuma's arrival. This part was crazy. Now, we did see Kuma earlier in the arc already. Kuma came to Thriller Bark on a mission to tell Moria that the government had found their replacement warlord for Crocodile, which was going to be Blackbeard, which I called in my theory video. Blackbeard is the first warlord to have a 0 bounty, which is also an interesting detail they threw in. And although we see Kuma on the island, it's explained that his only role here was to inform Moria on this matter and that he had no intentions to fight. However, earlier we had seen Kuma perform an insane move where he just poofed Perona into thin air. When he arrived at the dock, he took off his glove, opened his Bible, and asked Perona if she could go on vacation, where would she want to go? Perona, being her silly self, answers, and boom, she's just gone. This was insane. Where did she go? Is she dead? I don't know, but Kuma got a whole lot more interesting after this. And then we can see him freaking teleport too, as he teleports behind Nami and asks her about Ace and Luffy, so something's going on there too. After all this, learning that Kuma was only on the island to inform Moria of the news, but randomly appearing at the end of the arc when you thought he'd left was a crazy twist. All of these happy people were so excited to get their shadows back, and the crew had just put their life on the line to save everyone, and Kuma gets an order to eliminate everyone. Probably the most devious third party I've ever seen. It felt like almost all hope was lost here, and is really a great example of how One Piece can sometimes make relief feel fleeting, and that you shouldn't hold on to it for too long. Good examples of this are like when Eneru resurrected himself on Skypiea, or the Going Merry saving the crew only to become broken just afterwards. The crew try to fight off Kuma, but it doesn't work as he barely even breaks a sweat. We get to see more of his abilities here, like learning he's eaten a devil fruit that gave him a weird paw ability, to which Robin thought deeply about. He can teleport around, he can warp people to God knows where, swear, and with all the crew's failed attempts to stop Kuma, he just blows up Thriller Bark with a paw print bubble, which leads us to the absolute peak moment. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm sure many of you were waiting for this moment to come up in the review. Zoro's sacrifice. After the ship is blown up, Zoro's left standing and hits Kuma with a sick slash move, and it's revealed Kuma is actually a cyborg. He was crafted by some dude named Dr. Vegapunk for the government to be their robot pacifist. This reveal was really crazy and also super unexpected, and it also explains why he's like 12 feet tall. But even after an aura farm slash moment from Zoro, that wasn't enough to stop Kuma in his pursuit to take Luffy back to the government, which is when Zoro steps up to the plate in a different way. Zoro realizes the outcome of the situation, and for the sake of the crew, decides to offer himself as sacrifice instead of Luffy. This was a really interesting moment for me. Zoro's decision made complete sense and was very in character for him, but what I thought was interesting is why Kuma decided to handle the situation this way. Why didn't he just accept and kill Zoro there on the spot? I know he said the pain of what Luffy went through would easily kill Zoro, essentially underestimating how much of a goat he is, but it was still such an interesting decision to go about it that way. Zoro accepts the offer, and in another really important scene, stops Sanji from trying to take the sacrifice as well. This moment hit me pretty hard because of the fact that it was Sanji. These two are always bickering and going after each other's throats, but when push comes to shove, they're straw hats and they'll do anything to save one another. And so, seeing Zoro knock Sanji out to make the decision for them both, it was a bitterly heartwarming scene to witness. Kuma gives Zoro a taste of Luffy's pain, and he looks like me after a bad stomach ache, only for about 50 times more of that to come. And what happens after that? What does Sanji wake up and immediately go searching for Zoro to find happened? Absolutely nothing. Nothing happened. Peak. This was such a perfect scene for Zoro's character as someone who doesn't want credit for anything. Whether he thought he would survive that or not, he did what needed to be done, and that's all there is to it. And that's why he's the greatest second-hand man any crew could ask for. This entire section with Kuma honestly bumped my rating up of the arc by a significant amount, and that only continued to get higher as we get into the last part of the arc, Brook's story. To me, this was by far the most emotional section of the entire arc. Brook's backstory is, in my opinion, probably the saddest backstory we've seen in the entire show, which I know can sound crazy considering what we just saw unfold with Robin and knowing all of the other crew's stories, but man, this one was extremely brutal to watch unfold. It wasn't just sad in a dramatic way either. It was sad in a deeply lonely and hopeless way, and when you connect that back to Laboon, it hurts even more. We learned that Brook used to be part of a pirate crew called the Rumbar Pirates, which from all the flashback information we got seemed like a really decent group of guys who wanted to just spread positivity and sing songs to make the faces of children smile. And during this backstory, we learned Brook was the bard of the crew who would often sing songs and play instruments to keep morale up, which is when they encounter a tiny little whale who follows their boat and enjoys the tunes coming from aboard it, which turns out to be Laboon. Seeing all the adventures they went on with Laboon, the relationship Brook builds with him, and how sad it is when they ultimately have to leave him at the base of Reverse Mountain for his own safety was just so sad. And Oda stabbing the stake into our hearts even harder when we find out the reason Brook has been so protective over his afro for the whole arc is because now that he's a skeleton will be the only way for Laboon to recognize him if they ever reunite one day. So thank you, Oda. Now I've cried over a boat and an afro. And he wasn't done yet as we reach the saddest and most emotional moment of the entire arc, the song. When Brook ends up becoming captain of the Rumbar Pirates after their previous captain heartbreakingly dies of an illness, one day they're attacked and any of the crew who survived the immediate death are all inflicted with poison from weapons. And as the members of the crew begin their forever fall one by one around Brook, they know that he has the revived Devil Fruit ability, so they sing one last song for their faraway friend Laboon to one day hear the recording of. And this broke me. And I mean bad. The crew of these great guys with their last breaths singing their favorite sea shanty for their blubbery friend across the ocean to let him know how much he means to them as they fall to 4 left and then 3 and 2, and Brook is breaking down more and more until it's just him left. And from that day, Brook is left as a skeleton on the ship of his deceased crew members for 50 years, traveling alone in the endless sea of fog, not knowing if he'll ever get to fulfill his dream of returning to Laboon and playing the recording of his crewmates singing for him. This is such heartbreakingly incredible story writing that I couldn't even believe it when I was watching it. And don't even get me started on the actual Binks' Sake song too. I bawled my eyes out. I listened to it 100 times over after finishing the episode, and it's honestly gonna have a place in my heart forever. And the last thing that really got me is the moment after all the sadness of Brook's backstory is revealed, we see him happily singing along, laughing, and just being happy with this new crew, the Straw Hat Pirates. That contrast destroyed me. After freeing all these pirates on Thriller Bark who have been trapped for years, including himself, and having a great big party filled with so many happy people, he's able to play the music for real people again alongside the recording of his former crew, leading him to break down and yelling out that he's just so happy to be alive in this moment, and that he's no longer alone. He no longer has to play music for pretend people, he can play for the real thing. And he no longer has to worry if he'll ever have the chance to return to Laboon, as that hope has just fully returned to him, just like his shadow has. And damn if that doesn't make a grown man cry, I don't know what will. Like the Zoro section earlier, this entire part with Brook elevated my rating of Thriller Bark very heavily. If these two moments weren't in the arc, I really don't know what I would rate it. With everything wrapped up, I'm really interested to see how Brook will fit into the dynamic of the crew going forward. And it's also kind of crazy how quickly the Straw Hats have evolved in such a quick amount of time, adding Frankie and Brook, and Robin almost feeling like a new character being her real self after Annie's lobby. It really does feel like a new era for the Straw Hats is beginning, and I like it. Before the arc wraps up, there's a quick bit of lore that we learn, and that's when Lola gives Nami a blank piece of paper called a Vivre card, which I immediately recognized as the same card Ace gave Luffy during their split in Alabasta. We learned its importance, that Nami now has a card to Fishman Island, and that Ace's card is slowly burning away, which only happens if the owner of the card's health is in bad shape. I'm very curious how this is going to play out in the future and how much it will impact the story's direction going forward. Overall, I think Thriller Bark is a good arc. The theme was great and very fleshed out, the comedy bits were consistently hilarious, a lot of the fights were entertaining, we got an insane encounter with yet another Warlord of the Sea who ended up giving us probably the best Zoro moment, and we gained a new member of the crew who, in the biggest sense of the word, deserves to be around good people again. And while yes, this arc had multiple things that I would consider negatives and definitely lowered my ranking, such as the multiple perversion bits, the slow pacing at times, and its variety of unimportant or uninteresting side characters, I still found many reasons to like it. Thus, with everything I mentioned, I'd probably give Thriller Bark around a 7 to 7.5 out of 10 as a rating, because I do think among its negatives, there's a whole sea of positives that you just have to love. And that is my review. Thank you all for tuning in, I hope you enjoyed. If you don't know, I do tweet my entire watch experience live over on my Twitter, which you can see on the screen right here if you'd like to follow. Appreciate y'all watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Bye!